and will be made available on stopRED.org following the presentation, probably by the end of the week. Please take the quick survey at the end. That's really important to us in our funding. Our next session is planned for June 25th. We're going to skip May due to conferences and other engagements. So plan on joining us for the next one on June 25th. I want to thank our funding source. Funds are made available for this project through the Missouri Department of Public Safety and the Missouri Juvenile Justice Advisory Group from funding provided by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the wonderful, amazing REI consultant with MJJA, Dr. Juanita Cleaver Simmons.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to kind of do a connection and an overview of childhood trauma and delinquency. And I have been thinking about the theme, Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and as well as a number of other thoughts in reference to this. I've started studying and researching this, and it is something that is a part of a relatively recent national conversation when we look at trauma and teen and childhood delinquency. As you probably already know, that the United States Department of Archives talks about children who have been exposed to violence, that they're more likely to abuse drugs and have addiction problems, suffer from depression, anxiety, post-traumatic disorders, fail or have difficulty in school, and become delinquent and engaged in criminal behavior. Our interest and focus basically, although we look at all of these other areas and symptoms, to become more aware of how the trauma connects to their behavior, so that as we in the areas of enforcement, some who are there and some in counseling in the various areas, can at least be aware of that connection. Nationally, the conversation is called ACE, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And adverse childhood experiences, according to the research, actually promotes trauma. But the unaddressed trauma becomes what they call dirty pain. And the dirty pain is that which is thought to produce negative behavior, the behavior that brings the child into relationship with many of you in your various positions. So it refers to potentially traumatic events and circumstances that impair an individual's sense of safety during childhood. And note that nationally, they are defining childhood as 0 to 17 years. And these experiences can be brought about from war, from sexual, emotional, physical abuse, witnessing violence within the family or community, household changes and instability, parental separation, divorce, substance use, or mental health problems within the family. So it's not just the adverse childhood experiences of the child, but also the surrounding connected ancillary supports are what should be supports to the child, whether it's family or surrogate relationships. I was looking for a definition of dirty pain, because pain is pain, and how does it become dirty? But that's the pain that is the avoidance kind, the blame, the denial. And when people respond from their most wounded parts, where they have been hurt or traumatized, they can become cruel or violent or physically or emotionally run away from it. And that's when they experience what is called dirty pain. They also create more of it themselves and others. You've heard of the statement that hurt people, and that's dirty pain. So research is looking at the exposure to these adverse childhood experiences and how they increase the likelihood of a child having criminal activity. And so it's a growing concern in policy conversations and psychological research because of the lifelong impact that adverse childhood experiences can have on one's neurological development that manifest in the prevalence of various negative mental health outcomes. So it doesn't often just go and disappear. But the lack of knowledge that many of us have in this field, and I am learning and studying and researching this, and I have a certification in special ed background, but this is something that has not been prevalent in the conversations about criminal involvement when we look at trauma. We have had, we're connecting it better, and I think it's a good thing that we are. But we're finding out that it increases recidivism rates of juvenile delinquents. And of course, you know that that's additional cost for families and the judicial system, the changes that families go through. But I put in bold print here, schools do not have many resources that focus on at-risk youth. And I put that there because at the end of the presentation, I want to show you what Missouri is doing as far as providing services within schools for at-risk youth versus how they are providing policing. And the two are not in sync with each other. So we want to look at that, and Missouri is no different from many of the other states we've looked at. Trauma-related symptoms that go undiagnosed can lead to antisocial behavior, disorders, and substance abuse. And so it does develop into a number of other things. And what happens is, rather than to, when we see the delinquent behavior, rather than to treat it, often what we do, instead of focusing on the solution, is we criminalize the child and have debates about whether or not it should be an area of certification or what. So when we look at the justice system, and I thought this was really interesting, they found that severe childhood trauma was evident in 71 of 95 people executed. 75% of the people on death row between 20 and 24 were people who actually had experienced severe childhood trauma. And they were under 32 of that number were under the age of 25. So that goes to show us that we do really need to have some connections there and to have more conversations to understand that it doesn't exist in isolation, but it often bridges the path from trauma to engagement with the justice system if we do not identify it, recognize it, become informed, and try to address it. They go on to say in this, and I encourage you all to read this article and called Articles of Interest on Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's several articles that you can pull up online under this one category of articles of interest, adverse childhood experiences. But they say that 80% of the adult prison population meets the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, pre-existing diagnosis of conduct disorder before the age of 15. Now, let me repeat that. 80% of the adult prison population meets the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, which requires a pre-existing diagnosis of conduct disorder before the age of 15. And we want to look at that because of better understanding the long-term risk of these early childhood experiences. According to the Kids Are Not All Right, and I do have a slide put together for you all to have a list of readings and possible um, book reviews. But kids are not all right actually designed this graphic showing how under childhood trauma, which is brought about as some event that overwhelms the child, is emotionally distressing, painful, or whatever, can bring a 2 times more likely experience for the child to develop depression, 3 times more likely for anxiety disorder. And of course, many of the common causes include child abuse, as we talked about, grief, war, terrorism, witnessing or becoming a victim of violence, neglect. But the one thing of all of these that I have not found, and we're just including in the conversation, is racialized trauma. So when we talk about intersections, meaning the overlayered effects of several different ailments, several different symptoms of mental health disturbance, they normally have not included racism in that, but we know from working with our disparities, and not just in Missouri, but nationally, the racial disparities of the teens, we know that that problem exists, but it's not listed as a form of trauma here. They go on in their illustration to talk about the long-term impacts. Your perception of reality takes away from your sense of safety, all the insecurity, the threats that you have, creates relationship problems, triggers the fight, flight, freeze response, and all of that. But when they look at the effect that it has on the brain and the development of the child, you will see that the part that should be the decision-making part that should take control of actions takes a back seat. Instead, the overactive part, the fear center, takes precedent, and the emotional regulation takes control when someone has had severe childhood trauma. And it looks like this. And I got this from the National Institute of Health in their report. Um, when it becomes so traumatized that it's considered post-traumatic stress disorder that has been caused by the trauma, then often we confuse that behavior with delinquent behavior. But if you see the image here, you'll see that the part of the brain, rather than the prefrontal cortex, where you would do those basic functions of empathy, insight, response, flexibility, emotion regulation, all of those things for making good decisions, that takes a back seat. And where I put the error is where the priority, where the functioning then tends to take place. And that's the fight, flight, freeze, stress response. The question is, am I safe? Do people want me? And the emotions that's there. And many of you who have lived and experienced the work of young people, you have probably been in an environment or have had counseling or some experience with young people, and you could tell that they're reacting from the limbic brain function rather than the prefrontal cortex. And that is a response to that which can immediately cause delinquent behavior. So, of the 7 pieces of the impact of childhood trauma: cognition, physical health, brain development, emotions, behavior, mental health, relationships, all of that, all of those areas will be impacted in some of the children, and some may have all 7 of these categories a part of their trauma. Some may have 3 or 4, but unaddressed, undiagnosed trauma can quickly bring about several of these 7 forms of trauma responses. Yet, and I hope that you'll shoot a picture of this, the seldomly addressed racialized trauma area. And I am suggesting that if you want to get into a book study or a group because you're not finding a lot of information on racialized trauma of children that's a part of the intersection of these other experiences that we've talked about, then here are some sources that I found for additional information. And one includes the Juvenile and Family Division Annual Report that you can pull up online, the Guide to Black Mental Health, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and they're finding that after several generations, still there is the epigenetic carryover from generation to generation of severe racism and social isolation still carrying on. And the studies that show in the lifespan of the average Black child who might be 15 or 16 right now, they would have experienced Trayvon Martin, Floyd, Sandra Bland. You go on and on and on. And then the current book banning and some of the other things of no diversity, no, and withdrawing all of that. And you can imagine that by the time a youth of color is 15 or 16, that part can quickly establish a form of racialized trauma. And so I encourage you to, whether you agree with it or not, see what some of the recent studies are saying on that. Liz and I were able to meet Henning in Kentucky with her book of The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And NPR just recorded an interview last week that she had speaking of that and the mental health part and trauma. Know what some of the current conversations are. Kids are not all right, the trauma and how it affects even the development, and that's something you can pull up online. Between the World and Me by Coates, My Grandmother's Hands. And then there's a book that was provided by Marsha a while back, and I found information in that, and I've listed this too, in case you want to know more in that area. The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health, that's listed there. And so, in My Grandmother's Hands, I love that book. That's another one of the books that I think came about through MJJA, but it talks and it gives some of the healing methods for trauma. It's called Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, My Grandmother's Hands. And so many of you are working with youth of color. And so I would encourage you to at least have some parts of what's being said. Now, in addition to all of the areas that we've looked at so far, according to Childhood Trauma Model, the impact of trauma is more pronounced for Black youth because of systemic racism, and we just talked about that. Black youth are nearly twice as likely to be arrested for violent felony as white youth, and you all already know that. It's the basis of our disparities that we study and that we work for. And they go on to say that Latino and white youth who experienced trauma were no more or less likely to be violent felons than those who did not experience trauma. And in the studies, they were trying to find out then what is it that encourages that more, or that the outcome seems to be increased when it comes to Black youth. And the study found that systemic racism, and we can deny institutional racism, systemic racism, but there are studies that show some differences there. In the same study, they found that exposure to childhood trauma is linked to violent felony arrests, and the risks are elevated for Black children. The likelihood of violent felony arrest increased by 11% for each additional trauma experience. For each additional trauma experience. They go on to say that youth who experienced 3 or more types of trauma were 1.7 to 3 times as likely to have violent felony arrest. And I direct you to Johnson, whose book is called Trauma, Race, and Risk for Violent Felony Arrest Among Florida Juvenile Offenders. And she did a very, very extensive study. So the intersection of gender and class does hinder the appropriate resources that buffer the impact of trauma. And the reason why it hinders those resources is because we don't tend to include, when we look at all of the traumatic experiences of those things that bring about adverse childhood experiences, we tend not to really include gender as much, nor the thing of race. And so it makes it difficult to actually buffer and to fill in the needed resources because we are not acknowledging it. And that's my purpose in also including that today. So society often prescribes felony convictions for children's symptoms of trauma-induced distress and is more likely to do so when the child is Black. Inequalities across schools, healthcare institutions, juvenile justice systems to provide treatment and basic services to Black children is where we tend to have the gap because we don't know what and how because it hasn't been addressed and we've been afraid to even talk about it, and there's very little out there, but we need to be aware of it. I wanted to give you an example of a case in point to what I'm saying. And this is not to deny anyone or to minimize their guilt and what they did, but to show how this is such a perfect example. Last Friday, they executed a young man, Mikhail, in North Carolina. And if you read his story, you will find that, and they did it April 11th, which was Friday, you will find that he is a class of so many of the intersections of those adverse childhood experiences. And you can pull up that link and read on him in several different areas. The Guardian has a write-up on it, and I think the New York Times, but he was executed last Friday, and his trauma began at the age of 4. He had a number of experiences. He suffered from depression, suicide thoughts. He spent most of his life in jail and in juvenile detentions. But the catch of it was, as I was saying, that we have not treated these things in many of our juvenile centers. The catch of it was that he spent most of his time in solitary from the age of 14 on. In fact, one study shows, and I highlighted it here, that instead of receiving the mental health care he needed, he was thrust into the prison system at age 14. He spent the rest of his childhood and young adulthood in custody alone. From 14 to 21, which are the key years for brain development, he spent a collective 8,000 hours in solitary confinement, including one particular period of 1,700 consecutive hours, which is more than 2 months, and another stretch, 500 hours, weeks in solitary without any type of treatment, counseling, exposure, and this was during the developmental period. So his traumatic childhood at home and in custody shaped his life and actions to the point that he asked for his execution to be that by gunfire, and they went on through with it. Another area that I think when we look at trauma, we need to include, and MJJA has done a lot in this area, from conferences to lunchtime to seminars on autism, and understanding that the spectrum does have 4 different categories, and sometimes in our juvenile centers and in enforcement, we are not aware of it. There's a cognitive part, there's an emotional part, there's a behavioral part, and so sometimes we're only looking at the behavioral part and not understanding that if they are part of the autism spectrum, that this behavior may be as a result of autism. And often we are not diagnosed, we don't have the diagnosis for it. And when they're into detention centers and other places, often we can't respond because we don't know. And so that's the purpose of knowing. And we do salute and recognize, on behalf of MJJA, we salute April as Autism Acceptance Month nationally, in case you weren't aware. And we have brought in the many of the autism specialists, Asperger's, onto the finalists for the CNN Hero of the Year for Autism. They have come in and spoken and done some training. And in my conversation with one of them this morning, I did share that on behalf of MJJA, we have been proudly a part of the work of autism information and acceptance. I want to give you these articles and then we're going to open up for discussion because I want to hear from you. I went through this quickly so that you could have time to discuss this. But this is the link that I was telling you about, articles of interest on adverse childhood experiences, the effects on mental health. And there's several articles. This came out at the end of March. And so you can pull it up. DPI, if you're not aware of it, is Death Penalty Information Center. And they have a lot of data where they have historical data on people who are on death row or who have been on death row, and they track them back into some of the childhood experiences that many of them have had, and want you to be aware of that. So just kind of as a review, we want to look at trauma, resistance, and resilience. As we talked about before, the nervous system reacts to persistent stresses of oppressive systems. This repetition of this experience as adverse can bring about the fight response to protest. It can bring about flee to distance self. It can do the freeze where they want to say or do something but can't seem to mobilize. It can do the flock where they connect with like others, and this is where gang involvement comes. They don't know how to respond, and so they try to select where they fit in and they're comfortable with others who tend to have these similar characteristics, and this is where you get your gangs. And then you have fawn, those who appease and seek to comfort others, just go along with whatever it takes. There is a form of trauma that is considered generational trauma that I spoke about earlier. It is slightly different from the epigenetic trauma, but it does interconnect and overlap. It's not only experienced by one person in a family, but extends from one generation to the next. And they found this out by the studies done by Fernstein some years ago, looking at children whose parents or who were generations from the Holocaust, who had survived it, and looking at them and their behavior and their learning patterns. And they began to study that there is a generational effect in trauma, and it can be brought about from social or political persecution, including police profiling and surveillance. If every time you look up, you're under surveillance, about one thing or the others, but others who are in that similar environment with similar behaviors are not under surveillance, that can bring about a form that sparks that generational trauma that you know has gone down for years. Natural disasters, racism, genocide, anti-Semitism, child abuse, neglect, alcohol accidents, a lot of these things. And when we look at generational trauma, it can be inherited genetically through epigenetic inheritance. And this is why some people argue that generational trauma is epigenetic, but generational trauma is carried through, it can be carried through genetic, through those genes, the epigenetic type trauma. It can be passed down through behaviors, thought patterns, nuances, ways of being. And this is why sometimes you will have young people who might be third or fourth generation of incarceration. The trauma that is passed down and the type of behavior passed down because it influences how people cope, how they make decisions, how they view things, how they handle traumatic events. It can be silent, it can be undefined, considered normal by those who experience it. It can be a part of a family behavior. And if you want to know more on that, see race-based traumatic stress, a unique psychological distress that Black, Indigenous, and people of color suffer as a result of racism and discrimination. So, what are some of the symptoms of this generational trauma? And I'll go through this quickly. Web of emotional scars. Some people call it ancestral or intergenerational trauma. Now, this intergenerational trauma can go not just from people of color, but for people who are not of color, who have had experiences generationally of some form of racial response, whether they were the victim or the culprit. And then timely recognition. The scars are silently passed down from generation to generation. And it's hard for them to break it because it becomes a part of a norm and they don't see it as anything unusual. And then no one steps out to break the generational curse because they don't speak about it. It's a hush-hush thing. They say Uncle so-and-so just acts that way, even if it's reoccurring behavior and patterns, repeated patterns like abusive relationships. The father beat the mother, then you marry somebody who beats you. I mean, it's generational. It can be. Avoidance, coping. Many of the families who have trauma like this, for some reason, um, I was trying to pull that down, have a tacit route to avoid discussing it. Don't talk about this. This is family business, so it's buried in the family history of suffering and silence. They don't want to talk about it. So they build a type of resilience to it where they resist it. Now, when we look at what schools are doing, and we encourage trauma-informed schools, Missouri does have, from their Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, a trauma-informed school initiative. And it came in under Bill 638, where they do say trauma-informed approach. They encourage the trauma-informed schools that realize the widespread impact and all of that, respond to by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into its policies. I don't know that I've seen a lot involved with the policies and procedures and practices. And I've looked at the teacher standards for Missouri and the administrator standards. But there is this trauma-informed thing for school initiatives. And I wanted to put this up because some of you are working with restorative justice, and other types of events and practices, some of the programs that MJJA may have statewide. And so you're communicating with schools and police officers and all. And so hopefully in your conversations, you will know that Missouri has approved a trauma-informed school initiative as you try to establish those community connections. The implementation of this approach is more of an organizational approach, though. And so it means that it's not just a model implemented that's simply modeled, monitored for fidelity. It has to be a profound paradigm shift in knowledge, perspectives, attitudes. It needs to be talked about. And we need to talk about it to each other, that it's there, but it's not active unless we make it active, because it has been something that was approved through a Senate bill, as I showed you in Missouri. So the continuum begins with becoming trauma aware, and that's what we're doing today, becoming a little more aware. I wanted you to also see what ACLU has said, that we talk about trauma, but nationally, there are 1.7 million students in our schools. 1.7 million students are in schools with cops, but no counselors. 3 million are in schools with cops, but no nurses. 6 million are in schools with cops, but no school psychologists. 10 million in schools with cops, but no social workers. And that goes to show you how we really need to beef up our end of trauma-informed care for our kids, for our young people. Now, I'm not arguing that they need to reduce the number of police securities in schools because you and we all know that a lot's happening in our schools today. And I would want to make sure that my grandkids are protected in schools. And so our conversation is more about how can we increase it. We're calling ourselves being trauma informed, the presence of more counselors, nurses, school psychologists, and social workers. So how does Missouri look?
I was actually
Well,
wondering, sorry, quick question, sorry to interrupt. So I wonder if we can cut that down if we just made schooling virtual and then there's no need for like police officers. You just redirect those funds to, I don't know, maybe counselors, have them on like a 10, like a caseload type deal and they just meet them virtually. I don't
I
know.
would, that's an interesting point. I don't know. I'd have to look at, I have the history of public schools in America. And I'm trying to remember whether public schools were a mandate and how it was a part of a constitutional effort. And then if we make schools all virtual, then it is the assumption that someone is there to mediate with the child's learning, who is an informed person, number one. Number two, where would socialization skills come from a child? Number three, how will we know the knowledge level and the unified curriculum? Like you can look and say in the state of Missouri what it is that a third grade child should know in order to have successful high school completion and to prepare for a decent life in our society. There's a lot that would have to be teased out. And then lastly, but I'm sure there's several more, um, if that's done, then it's an assumption that everyone has access to internet and broadband and that someone is going to be there to supervise that. Um, so I don't know, there's a lot that needs to be talked about. And especially with that kind of thing, looking at virtual schools and all of this push for vouchers for private schools, um, that's something to think about. That's, any other thoughts? Because I can't see the faces with this screen until I'm off in a minute from this. But any other concerns? I see that there are three chats. What are some other thoughts that you all have?
Do you want me to read what's in the chat?
Yeah, let's stop and do that.
Okay, so Riley responded to that comment, more of a comment than a talking point. I'm afraid of a virtual school model for the kids growing up. COVID was the first run at it, and I know a lot of education. Oh, hold on. That was lost during that time. I'm sure things would be more refined as time goes on, but scary thought. I'm glad I'm done with school.
Yeah.
Ashley says there are also children who struggle to learn virtually. I feel like a virtual option should be available, however.
I was
And
also just thinking with the growing development of AI, maybe that will just inhibit more virtual growth. Because in theory, if they have a software that can meet the child where they're at, just like a lot of AI models, they could talk to the kid, meet them at their level. Maybe it's almost like a more personalized teacher. That's the way how I'm seeing it. I'm studying a lot about AIs and just seeing how it's growing, and it's just going to keep being a thing. And yeah, that's kind of the way I was wondering whenever I made that virtual that virtual schooling comment, because if you incorporate an AI model, in theory, the child could have a tailored assistant assisting them with whatever work that they could do.
That's an interesting futuristic type thing, and I guess it's right upon us. These conversations are very timely, and this is what probably will soon be discussed, as well as, the vouchers. Now, I know that when we look at our schools that have the title funds for free breakfast, many of the kids get their meals, the largest part of their meals because of schools. the breakfast, the lunch, the hot lunch meal, and then sometimes the after school snack. And a lot of the kids I know first time I heard of this, where they actually send meals home was in Missouri. But when I was working with certifying principals in Missouri through the University of Missouri Columbia, many of them had backpack programs where every Friday they sent kids home with backpacks with snacks and food so that they could eat until they get back to school Monday. And when my daughter was principal of one of the high schools here in Dallas, uh, they didn't have that program, but she started preparing little meal boxes in sealed containers and having them available so that kids, and she would sit in her office on Saturday mornings, so the kids who needed it could come and pick up stuff and take home to their families. And she was doing it at her own expense. My point is that there are federal funds for making sure that these kids are fed. And sometimes, because of the reporting requirements of educators, this is where a lot of times we help to interrupt abuse that takes place in their homes. So I do see the schools as very important entities in addition to the learning that takes place. So that's another discussion. Any other thoughts on that?
Marissa said another concern that could come up there would be that fully virtual education takes away outside adults' ability to access safety for students. We saw a huge decrease in reports during COVID. Abuse and neglect didn't decline. There weren't other eyes on the students to report it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a school-based DJO, and all of our students are on free lunch, and we send weekend baggers home and quite a few of our kiddos for the weekend. Without in-person school, a lot of students may not have food.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And unless you work in those environments, as she is saying, you don't really realize how much hunger is in America. You don't realize what's going on, food insecurities in certain communities. Um, it's a lot that unless you're actually in there and seeing it. Now, I agree that sometimes a choice thing can be a good thing. Um, but it's not for everybody, we'd have to be very careful of that. And back to the theory about policemen in the school, I love seeing them in there. I love seeing them there for the protection. I just hope that we put more emphasis on behavior and how to mentor children so that they'll know how to make right decisions, how to help remove some of the adverse situations or give a hand there that bridge, over the troubled waters, and then to provide counselors, psychologists, nurses, social workers there in the school, meeting the people where they are. I put this arrow here so that you could see where Missouri is. Can you see that? When you look at the number of students enrolled in Missouri public schools and look at the number of counselors, and then the number of social workers, 407, the number of psychologists, 188, and this is statewide, the number of nurses, 1,874, the number of teachers, 66,000. And I tried to calculate the 915,000. If you look at each of these areas, then you can see the extreme caseload. And then law enforcement. So you see where we are with that. And then when you look at school police compared to psychologists, nurses, social workers, and counselors, and we already saw that 1 in 44 children school age have experienced trauma, 1 in 44. When you look at that and when we look at the percent of students in school reporting police, 50% of them, but only 0.4% reporting counselors, 4% reporting psychologists, nurse, social workers. So you see that we've got some big gaps there. If you look all the way across, and I hope you can see this clearly. So we know that because of that, if there's more prevalence of that than counselors and psychologists and nurses, then you know there's going to be a higher increase of students who have referrals and arrest. And this data, we will make available, but I did get this from the U.S. Department of Education and their stats. So as I close today and open up the floor for discussion, when I looked at the history of children and trauma and how some of our systems have actually traumatized children unaware of their needs sometimes, I went back to one of the earliest executions, a youngest child to be executed. And Steny, if you all know about him historically, in 1944 in Clarendon County, South Carolina. They executed this boy at the age of 14. The other day, well, in December, some years ago, they actually went back 70 years after his execution and tossed it out 70 years after his execution to find out that, number one, a number of things went wrong from actually evidence to withholding certain testimonies, knowing that it didn't take place. Um, the landmark ruling overruled the previous decision that they had had, which would have allowed the execution of offenders as young as 16. And that was going on in 25 different states. And if you look at those stats, then you know that probably the highest percentage of executions, including lynchings, took place with Black men, and they were ranging from ages 15 to 26, the largest percentage 17. And so this is not a recent problem. This is something that we've had for a while. So with that, I think I'll just
We've got about
and hear from you. Hello, everybody. Are we there?
Yes, thank you so much for that. That was a great presentation. Got a lot of detailed information. I was also, I just did some school visits today with some kiddos. And so that was one of the questions I was asking while I was there at the school, if there were any like resources or agencies that comes to the school that helps with kids, with trauma. I know one elementary school that I visited, they have a can't think of the word off the top of my head, but they have like a classroom designed for these kids that can go, if they need extra time or extra help with things or certain resources or like therapy sessions and things of that nature. So I see schools starting to implement that now, but that was always a question. Are they designed to, work with kids who will have trauma or who are in the system or things of that nature? So I appreciate the presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to see some faces if I can. Hi, Anita Jones.
Hello, I was still eating my lunch over here. I was eating some Panera, so
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you joined us. And I know another Anita Jones, and there's Carmen. Hi. Um, any comments or any thoughts?
I'm just pretty much in my mind is just how we can address, because wasn't there a school shooting like a couple like weeks ago or something like that? And I was just wondering how we can cut that down, because the numbers showed pretty much like what I saw, that in counselors, if you add up the counselors, social workers, there was double the amount of them than police, but it's still such a wide gap. And I was just wondering, because I'm studying for my MBA, learning a lot about AI, like how to utilize it and stuff like that. And I just wonder if if all this mass shooting thing is going on just because class sizes are getting too big and out of control and no one can police it. Like here in Nixa, I looked at the news today, kid brought a gun to school. So that's what I was wondering. It's like, I wonder if some of the problems that we're having in schools with the arrests and stuff like that is just because schools are getting too big and there's too many kids to keep track of.
Well, I have some thoughts about that, but I want to see if others want to share or have a response to what Brendan is saying.
I think a lot of these kids think that the things that they're seeing like in the news and stuff is normal, so to say. So or like the games that they play, and they can't differentiate real world from like video games and social media and things like that. Also with, schools are probably getting overpopulated. So I think a lot plays into, what's going on. But this generation is kind of different. I think social media, and they can't differentiate reality versus, okay, this is not normal, so to say. So, yeah.
I don't think it's so much, it's like, because the virtual world is very much virtual, but things in the virtual world can manifest themselves in the physical world. And that's kind of what, like, and the way how they're training AI models in the sense of robotics is that they run thousand simulations into a program, and then they grab that simulation into a robot to then practice in the real world. That's why we have autonomous driving and stuff like that. But that's a robot. Whenever you put that in a kid, like they don't have that kind of, they didn't have the programs that the robot, the autonomous cars had. They're having it in real life, and that's whenever we're seeing kids crash out how hard they are. At least that's how I view it.
Okay, any other thoughts? Well, I happen to be in Dallas right now, and you all may have heard about the shooting that took place in Wilma Hutchins um, High School the other day. Um, and I look at those, and because I've seen, prior to that, one of the national shootouts in a school took place in a small private school. So I'm not sure that it has so much to do with the size of the school, um, as it does with people are bringing from home. We put so much into the answer for the schools, but people are bringing these situations from home and from their communities. And often those spats start on the weekend, right there in their own community, and it carries on into the school. Whether there are 25 people there or 2,500 or 2,500. And believe it or not, some of the weapons are given to those children by their parents. We had in Houston a parent driving like Shamrod or whatever they call the term through a student parking lot with the door open and a gun pointed. So we've got a sick society here, and the school can take so much responsibility to do what they can. But at the same time, we're going to all have to work in there together. And this is why the community engagement, why law enforcement with counselors, with psychologists, with educators, with preachers, we're going to all have to work in this together. And yeah, the computers, many of our kids, as someone was saying, from these games and things, they're overstimulated. And you all saw the image of that limbic brain where they make decisions, and all of that's overstimulated. And so, yeah, I would go for using AI in a mentoring program for teaching behavior, and how to respond. I see the hand, Teresa. Teresa, I see your hand.
Uh, yes, ma'am. My hand wasn't up. I just applaud what you say. I mean,
Oh, I thought you were waving.
the idea that school sizes are too large, I don't know. It's golly. It's behavior. It is behavior. It is, I don't know. I have nothing to add. I just applaud what you say. Thank you.
Yeah. we've got a lot of work to do. And I'm excited that O'Reilly is going to be talking to us about some of his successes with community engagement, because it's got to look at community engagement, because the schools cannot do it alone because they're competing with outside forces. They're competing with gangs in the neighborhood. They're competing with some parents who need to be parented themselves. They're competing with political leadership that may not show necessary humanity and empathy. And so they're dealing with a whole lot of decision making. And when they see people who are in top leadership positions commit so many repeated acts and are told, no, I will not acknowledge this, I will not step down. And it's happening locally, statewide, nationally. It shows a message to young people. But we're afraid to talk about that. But in reality, what are we showing our young people? You understand? So yeah, I'm with you, Brandon, that we need to look at a contemporary way to reach them.
Because this AI stuff, it's not slowing down. That's what, if my semester's wrapping up, it's not slowing down.
It's not what?
It's not slowing down.
Oh,
Like
yes.
it is here to stay, and it's gonna revamp. Like in my class, they're pretty much giving us a heads up. They said that just like how in the 80s, whenever people had to learn how to incorporate the computers in the workplace, the new generation, our struggle is going to be how to incorporate artificial intelligence into the workplace.
Oh, yeah.
That's why they said start working on your prompts now and how to interact with it and how to pull in information. So it's just bizarre. It's just bizarre. And then, hey, that's why I was thinking, like, because all these kids now, they're going virtual. Like, there's so many kids. Like, I work in family court, and a lot of divorce solutions, like, oh yeah, we'll just have them do virtual, and then they go back and forth, and it's like, okay, and then their kid is acting up because it's not socialized. But then whenever they try to file something to get the kid socialized, he crashes out even harder because he's never. So it's like, what do you do? What do you do? Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether they have set some standards yet for AI, but there are some people who are now confused with images, whether or not it's that real person saying certain things versus the other. So there's so much still to be done, and I'm glad to know that someone of your position has an interest in that, because we're going to all need some guidance and leadership, and hopefully some insight from the inside, those of us who are working directly with these children. So we're almost out of time. Any other comments I'd like to hear? Have we missed anyone? Well, again, we want to thank you for joining us, and I hope that you will actually do more reading on the trauma, because we need to be informed. This needs to be our conversation. Those of us who work with young people, it needs to be our conversation before others grab it and take it in another direction and omit some of the things that we know need to be confronted. I'm going to turn it over to Liz, and thank you all for being here again.
Thanks, Dr. Simmons. Yes, please take the survey. The link is in the chat. Our next session is going to be in June 25th. Information and registration for that will be coming out soon. We also have our MJJA conference in St. Louis coming up May 21st through 23rd. We'd love to see you there for that. We also have a free training that's going to be in Kansas City on June 3rd. It's Tall Cop. Substance abuse awareness, that's specific to Missouri, and much more. He's a great presenter. I definitely urge you to sign up for that if you can. All of that is on our website. You can find it on stopRED.org. Be sure to check out our blog while you're on there and past lunchtime learning recordings. Thanks again, and I hope to see you guys in June.
Thank you. Straight up 1 o'clock. We did it.